This episode is brought to you in part by the Table Podcast from the Hendricks Center at Dallas Theological Seminary. I'm Darrell Bach, one of the hosts, and I invite you to join us as we discuss issues of God and culture, which includes anything and everything. Listen on your podcast app or at dts.edu/thetable.
Welcome to episode 81 of the Grace Enough podcast. I am your host, Amber Cullum. Today I sit down with Tricia Goyer to discuss the tools she uses to calm angry kids. She has 10 of them, so her toolbox is very full. You will hear how the grace of God is weaved throughout her story, which includes teen pregnancy, adoption, fostering, homeschooling, and publishing over 70 books, one of which includes Mom's Night Out, inspired by the hit movie. Today you will hear how God answered Tricia's prayer. God, I have screwed up big time. If you can do anything with my life, please do it. She also shares a mantra she speaks over and over again when dealing with an angry child. She uses it to help keep herself calm. And questions you can ask to help children move from the emotional part of their brain to the thinking part of their brain. Before we dive into our conversation, I want to invite you to become a part of the Grace Enough community. You can visit graceenoughpodcast.com and sign up for my newsletter. If you are listening to this episode when it releases, which is August 2020, you will receive a free download when you sign up. 10 scriptures to pray as we begin a new school year during a pandemic. As a side note, the scriptures can be prayed during the whole year as they cover topics like trust, protection, and peace. I printed mine off, laminated it so that I can use it on a daily basis. With that, here is my conversation with Tricia Goyer, episode 81, Calming Angry Kids. Good morning, Tricia. Welcome to the Grace Enough podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great being here.
Will you go ahead and introduce yourself to our listeners? Tell us a little bit about your family and what you do.
Okay, well, I'm Tricia Goyer. I've been married to John for 30 years.
Wow,
we
congrats.
have 10 kids, 3 biological, then we've adopted 7. And I'm a homeschool mom, a writer, a speaker. So every day it's a balance of taking care of kids, making meals, doing laundry, writing books, writing a newsletter. I was speaking a lot. That all got canceled. But it's just every day it's a balance of all these things.
Yes. Well, and what is your youngest child? How old?
9.
Okay, so you are homeschooling how many currently?
6.
Okay. Don't you have grandchildren too?
I do. So my oldest son is 31. So I was a teen mom before I met and married John. So he's 31. He's married with 4 kids. He lives in town. So
girl, you are busy.
I know. I love it. And then I have a daughter who's in the Czech Republic. She's a missionary.
Nice.
And she's married, and she has one that's a year and a half. And we video call every single morning.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. So, I feel like we spend a lot of time together, even though she's on the other side of the world.
Yeah.
And then my 26-year-old's a college student in town. Our 20-year-old's a college student in town, and she has a baby. And then we have 6 at home. So busy.
But what a gift that you have so many close to home.
Yeah, our one is on the other side of the world, but everyone else is within 10 minutes.
Yeah, that's great.
So that's really
and
good.
that's a whole conversation I feel like we could have about how has it impacted your daughter, this whole COVID thing. But we won't get into that as far as in being halfway across the world. I mean, it's
well, she was supposed to come home for Easter for 5 weeks, and she hasn't been able to. So they still have their plane tickets. Her and her husband, her sister-in-law, and a cousin, her husband's cousin, were all going to come. It's been 5 weeks, and then that was all canceled. So hopefully, I don't know, fall, winter, I don't know when the flights are going to be available again.
I know. It's just a lot of unknowns. It's like, there's some things that are really consistent about every day right now, but then there's just all of these, people are trying to plan conferences, and as a speaker, it's like, am I going to have to do it online? Will we ever be in person again? It's just so strange.
Yeah, every one of my conferences, I think I had 7 in the spring and summer, and all of them were canceled.
Yeah.
So,
and then fall, are people scheduling people, or how's that working out?
Even my September one was canceled too. So far I have nothing on my schedule, which is amazing, except my garage is filled with books because I would sell a lot of books at conferences and have boxes and boxes of books that
well,
are
and that's
there.
a good segue a little bit into your story, because you've authored over 70 books. Isn't that correct?
Yes, I have.
And I mean, I have to give a little shout out because you authored Mom's Night Out.
Right. I did the novelization of it, yes.
And so what was it like? Like they had to come to you to say, hey, we like this story. We want to put it in movie form?
Actually, it was opposite. So they had the movie and they wanted to do a book out of it. So I got this call from a publisher that said, we were trying to find someone to write this book to go with this movie. Would you be interested? I'm like, moms that are like completely overwhelmed and need a night out. And yes, let's call Tricia Goyer.
Yeah, that's awesome.
She can obviously do it. So it was super fun because I got the movie. It's probably like 90% complete. So there were some parts that just say insert dialogue about this, like it'd have a black box.
Right.
But the rest of the movie was all there. And I just sat down and watched it over and over and over again and wrote the book. So that was super fun. I got to go to the red carpet.
That's so cool.
And be there with all the actors and actresses. I'm like, everyone's like looking at me like, who are you? Here's Sean Astin and all these people in front of me. And then I'm like, hey, but it was fun.
That's okay though, because it's like, hey, here's my book. I got to do something. I was a part of this too.
Really
so that's
cool.
really cool.
Yeah. It was super fun.
Well, your story is so saturated with the grace of God. And honestly, as I was just thinking about what would I ask Tricia, because you talk about so many different things, I just thought, I want to know a little bit about your faith journey. And I feel like in order to set the stage for people who may be listening, they need to know so much of what you've experienced. So if you'll share a little bit of that with us, I would be grateful.
Oh, I would love it. So I grew up when I was little, our family did not go to church. And so it was around second grade, my mom and my grandma, they started going to church. It was actually my aunt that came back from college. I think she'd been involved in like Campus Crusade for Christ. Ended up telling my mom and my grandma about Jesus, and they became Christians. And I remember them getting baptized. I remember going to like First Communion at a Catholic church, and then all of a sudden we're going to this new church, and it was a total different experience. They were different people. And the next door neighbor also witnessed to my grandma, and it was just this community all of a sudden overnight where all of a sudden I'm sitting next to my mom and my grandma in the pew, and they're singing hymns. And so really from second grade on, it was that time with this small church community. And I remember, and I've been thinking about this a lot, just the saints in that church that would just reach out to us and, have those potluck meals and give me hugs.
The church
and
potluck.
The mint in the pocket. Just that neat older community. We had a Sunday school teacher that would memorize verses, and we get prizes out of the treasure box. All those things. And I'm so grateful. But at home, my mom was a really young Christian. My stepdad was not a Christian. And so it was it wasn't like I grew up in a Christian family at home.
Right.
It really was just that kind of church experience. And then when I got to my teen years, I got into boys and boyfriends, and really it was, I still believed in God, but I just didn't want to think about him because I didn't want him to think about me and what I was doing. It was like, if I don't think about God, then, I'm sleeping with my boyfriend and all these things.
I can relate.
And then when I was 15, I had an abortion, got pregnant by my boyfriend, had an abortion, which is something I really regret. 17, pregnant again, same boyfriend. And that time I'm like, nope, I'm having the baby. Yeah. And so really dropped out of school. I was so embarrassed to go to school. Our school was like 200 people, the whole high school. So dropped out of school and just was like so depressed at home. And it was one day that I woke up and I thought of those women in church, and they still kept reaching out to me. They gave me a baby shower, even though, here I was, this pregnant teenager, the same sweet ladies from church. And I thought, if they still love me, maybe God does too. And that's when I just like, God, I have screwed up big time. That was my eloquent prayer. If you can do anything with my life, please do. And from that moment, I just felt this light and this peace in my heart. And I started reading my Bible. Really, it was a big transformation. I started going to church with my mom. It was like all in, because I knew like I was headed the wrong direction. And I just felt his peace and love in a way that I can't even describe.
Wow. Well, and you ended up meeting your husband. How old was your first son when you met your husband?
Okay, so this is a cool story. So remember that neighbor that I talked about that would witness to my grandma? Well, her sister-in-law and brother-in-law were pastors. And so we started going to that church. And so she'd always been my Aunt Lois. She's my grandma's neighbor. She's always been my Aunt Lois. Well, she's actually my husband's Aunt Lois. And so
I love it.
So we have pictures of us when we were little. We'd be like all with Aunt Lois and sitting around a table, like my mom and my grandma's baptism, and they're there with John's family. And so
Yes.
I kind of knew him growing up, but then they moved away. But we started going to his church, his dad's church, when I was pregnant. And it was like he was a cute drummer in the worship band. And I'm like, let's look at this. But on the day Corey was born, and here it is, I'm 17, had this baby, had him at 3 o'clock in the morning, was home by noon. I mean, I'm sure I put my jeans on the way home, just like popped this baby out, was home. And he came over that night, John did, and said, brought me a teddy bear and a card and said, hey, just want to let you know, congratulations. And I'm like, wow, he's cute.
So
and he
cool.
was, and really he was just reaching out, being kind. And a couple weeks later, my mom got a call from his mom who said, hey, if John asked Tricia out on a date, would she go? And so I'm like, yeah. And so it was like the moms were doing this calls back and forth connection. And he ended up asking me on a date. But the interesting part is a couple of years before, he had seen me at church. And he had been in the Marine Corps at the time. And he asked his mom, like, who is that girl? And she says, that's Tricia. Stay away from her. She's trouble. And so it tells you how much of a transformation was in my life. Because here it is after I had my baby. She's like, oh, yeah, take her on a date. So we started, like, he was there literally from the day Corey was born. Like, that's the first time he came over. And we started dating when Corey was 2 weeks old. We got engaged when he was 4 months old and got married when Corey was 9 months old. So literally he has been there from the beginning.
That's an incredible story because that's just so rare.
It is so rare. I mean, it just shows you he's such an amazing guy. And like once we started dating, I'm like, I'm not letting him get away. Like this is a great guy. Like unlike anyone I had dated before, he just loved God and he was just so caring. And so yeah, we've been married for 30 years now and Corey's 31.
Tell us a little bit about your family because as you said, you've adopted several. And so if you can kind of tell us a little bit about how all of those kids came into your life.
Yeah. So I had Corey when I was 17. And then we had Leslie a couple years later after we were married. And then we had Nathan a year after that. So I was 22. I had 3 kids. And we're like, we're done. I was just so overwhelmed as a young mom. He was going to school, working at Domino's Pizza. I was a stay-at-home mom, like completely young mom, overwhelmed. But then as the years passed, I think our youngest was about 7. I started thinking about adoption and, well, we're still young. There's lots of kids out there. And John was like, no, like right away. He's like, no, we're busy. And by the time I was writing, I had helped start a crisis pregnancy center. So we were busy. He's like, how are we going to do that? And the money, I mean, there's all those things that come up. Yep. And really, I just prayed about it. It wasn't like something I like talked about all the time, but I would just pray. I think I brought it up a couple times over the next probably 5 years. And then one day, he came to me and he says, are you still considering adoption? Because God had put it on his heart. And I think that is such an important thing. If I would have just kept hounding him about it and he would have like resigned to it, it would have not probably worked out well. That's but right. It was like, I stepped back and like, just, I would pray about it. Like, if it's supposed to happen, it's going to happen. And God really opened his heart to it. And we actually had started going through to adopt from China. And right when all our paperwork was in, they closed all of it down from, being able to adopt a healthy baby girl. I mean, literally like May, we turned in our paperwork and by like September, they're like shutting the doors. And I was so like, I've been waiting for 5 years. God, I don't understand. It was probably 7 years by this time. And then we waited another year because we still were unsure, like we weren't sure how long they were going to keep it closed, the Chinese adoption program there. But a year later, we got an email, and it was in November. We got an email that said, it might be 5 years. It might be never. What do you want to do? And I just remember going to bed and just bawling because here it was, 8 years by this point that I'd been wanting to adopt. We had spent this money in home studies. And I mean, it's a lot of work to get everything in China. And then they're saying, we don't even know if it's going to happen. And I just remember like an hour of my pity party. And then finally just like, God, the child, I mean, you put it on John's heart, you put it in my heart, like whoever it is, it might not be China. Just I have peace. And I just like totally relinquished it to him. And it was actually that very day, that afternoon, I was taking my grandma. My grandma's lived with us for 20 years too. She still lives with us. She's 90 years old. So
what a gift, though.
I know. She's right in the next room. But it was that afternoon I was taking her to Walmart and I got a call from someone I knew from MOPS. I didn't even know her very well. And she knew a young woman who was pregnant and was looking for a family. then they knew our story. I had talked about it at MOPS about the struggles with adoption, and she said, would you consider meeting her? And I'm like, yes. And so it went from that day thinking we're maybe 5 years, maybe never, to she was probably 6 months pregnant by the time we met her. So we had a baby within 3 months, and that really was the point where I just had to relinquish to God. Like, this is my plan, this is my idea, this is what we've been working for. But when I finally said, like, whoever, it was just like so clear that he put that my name on that my friend's heart that day to tell that young woman. And so we adopted Alyssa in 2010, and we moved from Montana to Little Rock that like a week after we got her. Like, literally, new baby, new part of the country, total culture shock. And then when we were down here, we heard about all the kids in foster care. And so a couple of years later, we adopted a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old, a 2-year-old boy and a 5-year-old girl from foster care. And then 3 years later, we opened our home to 4 sisters, ages 11, 13, and 15. So we completely adopted out of order so we adopted 6 girls and 1 boy in 5 years' time.
Goodness, girl.
Yeah.
That's...
Yeah, a lot.
It is incredible, though, because I listen to that, and so often we do struggle so much with God's timing and his purpose. But even as we read his word, we see so much waiting or people not understanding. And so when you look back in hindsight at your own life or at people, in God's word, it's like, oh my goodness, all along, he really does know.
Yes. Yeah,
and we just, it feels like you're putting this horrible roadblock up, but really it was like, well, it's not a baby in China that I have for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that prayer you prayed when you were 17. God, I have screwed up big time. If you can do anything with my life, please do it. And you have shared a few of the things that he has done already. But what are some other ways that you have really experienced God's answer to that prayer?
Yeah, I mean, just the fact that I've been married 30 years is just, on my whole side of my family, except for my grandma and grandpa, there's not been a marriage that's lasted, more than a couple of years. There's just divorce. There's tons of teen pregnancy. I think my brother, all my cousins, everyone has had multiple unplanned pregnancies. So it's just that whole cycle. Mm-hmm. My mom had me out of wedlock. My aunt, it's just a cycle that I feel God has broken. And just the fact that John and I are like happy and enjoying life, and then having these kids, which is, again, it's taking all these broken stories and then God's molding them together and building a beautiful picture. And it's not easy. There's kids coming from trauma. There's some hard things, but just the fact that we're a family and that we experience life together and that he has brought us all together is huge. And then the fact that I'm a stay-at-home mom that is writing books, writing articles. I have a high school diploma. Like, I don't have any degree. I don't have an English degree. And it has been going to conferences, meeting people, taking steps of faith, like, oh, I'm going to pitch an article to this magazine, which I have never had anything published before, but hey, I'm just going to take these steps of faith. And really, God has opened doors and just brought amazing mentors into my life, amazing people. And so really, I love talking to young moms. We have a young mom support group here in Little Rock that we meet during the school year, and just saying, like, if I can do it, you guys can do it. Like, I just have my high school diploma. I don't have a college degree. Wow. I don't have this training. It's just me trying really hard, taking these steps of faith, failing a lot. It was 5 years from the time I started writing till I got anything published, but it's like that persistence really pays off. And so much of my life is like, well, I'm going to try it. And I might not, get it perfectly right, but I'm going to keep trying and keep learning. And constantly I'm still like always taking online courses and learning things. And I just feel like if God puts it on my heart to try something, I just need to do my best effort. And it may not be perfect, but at least I'm doing something for him.
Well, and that reminds me of a conversation I had recently talking about rejection. And we were just talking about how, when that happens, we can really either become bitter or we can become better. And a lot of times it really is a choice. And in this case with rejection, I'm talking about business-wise. Like, you write, you put something out there. And I would say most people get the answer no before they get a first yes, right? And so
Oh,
just
absolutely.
pressing into that.
Absolutely. And I mean, I would write stuff and send it out and get and this is back in the day. This is really aging me, but we would send stuff through the mail
That's
with a
right.
self-addressed envelope for people to send the rejection letter back. And when email started, then it got easier. But I still get rejected. Like I still have book proposals that like, well, no one really picked that idea up, so let's just move on. It's not, even though I have 70 books, it doesn't mean every idea that I have is going to get picked up by a publisher. So, and there's seasons. There's one book idea that I had in 1999. And it was called Prayers That Changed History. And so these amazing people in history and times they prayed. My agent pitched it, didn't get anything. And then years later, it was like 15 years later, I was at a conference talking to an editor. And she's like, well, do you have anything for kids? And I'm like, well, I have this really old proposal. And I told her, and she was like, that's the book I want. And it was like 15 years later. It had completely been sitting on my hard drive. And now it was published, I think in 2000, I don't know, 11 or 12 or something like that. But it's amazing, like those ideas, it doesn't even mean it's for that season. Like just keep working at it, keep trying, put the words on paper, and you never know when God's going to use it.
Such a good word and so true. And I think anybody who's walked with Jesus for any amount of years, we can look back and say that's true. Like his faithfulness, we just see it all over the place once we've walked with him long enough. If you pay attention, it's very obvious.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, you're a mama to 10 and you have experienced being a foster parent. You are an adoptive parent. You're a biological parent. You've single parented for a short amount of time. You've really just run the gamut of various ways of parenting. And so with that, I know you've experienced a range of personalities and, like you said, trauma. And so we're going to shift gears and talk a little bit about calming angry kids. You wrote a book about that, but you really just have a lot of wisdom to share there. And so share with us a few things that you have learned about anger. And, well, let's just start there. Share a couple of things that you have really learned about anger in children.
Absolutely. So raising the first three kids, I mean, there's always the times you're upset. You might raise your voice a little and they get upset and raise their voice a little. But it was a completely new thing bringing kids in from trauma. And what I learned very quickly is that they have triggers. It may not be anything that I even understand. And it doesn't even have to be adopted kids. It could be any kids that might have something that triggers them. For example, we would be out and my husband would say, well, let's go to Burger King for lunch. Well, one of my kids would just get so angry. I'm not going there. And then she'd explode and all these things. Well, we realized a year later, I mean, this is a long time later, that when they were first taken from their biological mom, the police officer took them to Burger King for breakfast. And so anytime I mention a Burger King, and so, I mean, that's a very clear example, but there's small little things that would trigger them. And then all of a sudden they're angry. And with my three that had been raised in a stable home, they're angry. You say, don't do that. Go to your room. You discipline them. I would try to do the same thing and it would just expound the anger. And then I would get mad because they weren't listening to me. They weren't going to timeout or going to their room. And what I realized was their trigger and their anger, they actually needed me to acknowledge them and to draw them close instead of discipline them. So really, I think with a lot of kids, it's easy for us to give them consequences without really understanding what is going on in their heart and why are they angry. They're angry with their sibling. It makes no sense to me. And I was jumping straight to consequences. But really, again, either they were triggered or maybe it was their biological mom's birthday and I didn't know it. Or something else was going on in their hearts. Or maybe they had a bad dream. Or one of our daughters, she gets hangry. Like if she's hungry, and
me too, and I'm not adopted or fostered. So,
exactly.
And I'm dead serious about that.
So I think one of the things that I have learned is like what is behind the anger instead of reacting to it, instead of trying to immediately jump to consequences like, okay, no TV for you tonight. I mean, that was initially because that's the way I had raised the first three. I was going straight to those consequences. And now I could say, you know what? I just think you're hungry right now. Let's go get a snack. And just having that compassion and listening and acknowledging that. Another thing is acknowledging their anger. I'll say, you're angry. Yes, I'm angry because she said blah, blah, blah. Just acknowledging it is so helpful. Or you're sad. Are you sad? Is that why you're acting this way? And when you acknowledge their emotions, then they're able to jump from the reactions to the conversation. It moves from the emotional part of their brain back to the thinking part, and they're able to explain. I think so many times we're like, stop doing that. Don't act that way. You're not being nice. Go to your room. And we're not acknowledging there might be a legitimate reason why they're angry, or at least in their mind, it's a legitimate. So, but just by saying like, you're angry, what's going on? Or I could totally see one of our kids, when I could see emotions building, her knee just starts shaking. So I'll just say, are you nervous? Are you anxious? And I'll just start opening the conversation before all that explodes out of her. So it's like being aware, understanding where those emotions are coming from, and asking about it. And I think so many times we don't like dealing with it. We don't like dealing with the anger or the fits in the grocery store. So we're just trying to get it over as quickly as possible.
Yep.
We're trying to like, don't do that. We're going to go to the car or whatever. Instead, I think it helps them to start that conversation. Like, what's going on? What makes you so sad? Why are you so angry right now?
Well, and that's good for even me, because I don't have a fostered or adoptive kids, but I do have one of my biological children. She's so much like me that just really struggles with that outburst of anger.
Mm-hmm.
You know, something sets her off and her first response is an outburst of anger. Well, that's how I have always been.
Yeah.
And so number one, I can relate to her, but number two, I do exactly what you said so many parents do, right? Like the consequences.
Right.
But I have realized when I slow myself down enough to pay attention and go, what did make you angry? Why are you upset right now? Or I've also noticed with her, I mean, and this is true with a lot of kids, but the ones who are more prone to angry outbursts, for her, when she's tired, you can hang it up because
exactly. We have one like that too. Yeah, just like
I mean, and honestly, that's exactly the way I was. I can get hangry, and when I'm tired, like your emotions, like you said, you function more in that part of your brain instead of the thinking part. So that is so helpful for me, and it is something that can be really true for your biological children too.
Absolutely. And just stating, and I think sometimes when you say, why are you angry? Then they're like filling on the defense, but just saying you're angry.
Yeah.
And then just giving them space, and then just pausing and giving them space to tell you about it. Because I think sometimes like, why are you being angry right now? Then that puts them on the defense. Just say, you're angry. And sometimes you can say, you want to tell me about it, or what's going on? Or just doing it in a compassionate way really makes a difference. Another thing is not escalating with them. And I never thought I was an angry person. Like, I raised 3 kids. I always say like the before and after was God's like, oh yeah, let's really show you what's in your heart, because I never thought I was an angry person. But then
that's how he increases our empathy for other people. Right?
And then having a child like screaming in my face, or I think the worst, I get most angry when I see one kid acting out against another child in the home. And I would just like be following the kid and so angry. Yeah. And then they would say, oh, you just think you're perfect. I mean, they would just know how to provoke me. And I could just feel like my blood boiling and my fists balling up and my jaw tightening. I mean, just like, And I ended up talking to one of our kids' therapists about that. And I'll say, I just don't understand, like when she's in trouble and then she turns it around and starts provoking me, and then I get angry and it just explodes. And the therapist is like, she's doing that on purpose, right? I'm like, what are you talking about? She's like, if she gets you angry, then it takes the focus off of her.
That's right.
So all of a sudden you're like, I'm yelling, I'm so sorry, and you're apologizing, and you're not dealing with whatever the problem was. Maybe I have a child that used to steal from me a lot, or maybe whatever it is or maybe hitting another sibling or whatever. If all of a sudden I'm yelling, and then of course I'm going to apologize because I shouldn't do that, I'm an adult, then all of a sudden we're not dealing with the real issue. So she's like, the therapist is like, tell yourself this mantra. If I stay calm, I win. If I stay calm, I win. Because they want to provoke you. They're trying to provoke you on purpose, because then it gets it off of what they're dealing with. And so I'd literally stand there and like unclench my fists, release the breath, and just remember my job is to stay calm. And they will say things. They know exactly what buttons to push and not to let them do that. And so, and really just sending up a prayer like, God, just help me stay peaceful in this moment. And the more I stopped reacting, then the more they realized, okay, this isn't working. Yeah. A lot of that stopped. And so it is just staying calm goes a long, long ways.
If I stay calm, I win. Really, if I stay calm, we all win.
We all win. Yes.
Right? Because whether you're a trauma child or you're a biological child that struggles with anger, there's just no way to move forward unless somebody really does slow down and help you address what's going on inside of you.
Absolutely. And sometimes, and another thing the therapist should, I'm like, all this stuff, everything in Common Anger Kids is things that therapists taught me. It's like, as a mom, this is what I learned, but not dealing with it even in the moment. So maybe someone is acting out, talking back, being disrespectful, like whatever the issue is. So many times we try to lecture them, like, you're not supposed to talk that way, blah, 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 blah. And again, if they're in their emotional brain, the thinking brain is turned off. They're not hearing anything anyway. And the therapist is like, let them go to their room, even if they're slamming doors, because that's another thing, like, don't slam that door, whatever. Just let them go. Just let them go. And later, say, you know what, let's talk about this when you're calm. I mean, maybe, and she's like, my therapist is like, even go out to get the mail or whatever, like have a time in a car away when you're not in an angry moment. Say, what was that about yesterday or whatever, and don't deal with it. Because if we're lecturing, it is not getting through. It is like bouncing off their minds, and we're trying to get this moral principle into them, and it's not going to work in that moment because their thinking brain is turned off when their emotional brain is turned on.
Well, and isn't that so much like if I just think about myself? I mean, I'm not paying attention to someone if all they're doing is lecturing me and yelling at me and telling me all the things I need to do differently, and I'm an adult.
Right, exactly.
So it is very true. Well, and I know with anger, there's a couple of ways that kids tend to deal with it. There's this flight, there's fight. Talk about those responses a little bit and why it's so important for us as parents to identify the different ways that kids respond when they're angry.
Yeah. So the 3 ways are flight, fight, and freeze. And so flight is they're just going to take off because the emotions are so overwhelming. And I have one child that was definitely a flight child. There was one time she got upset with me when we were camping. I had took 6 little girls camping with this American Heritage things, and she's like in the woods because she's upset with me. Then the other child is crying because her sister's leaving. I mean, this whole thing. But flight is I need to get away from the situation. Mm-hmm. Like I just need to get away. I'm in danger, and they're going to take off. Now, sometimes, like that case, she was definitely like, she was in the woods. She was running away. Sometimes it is like going to the room, or another child will run down the street. I mean, all these things, they just want to get away, and that is an emotional response. Fight is they're going to stand their ground. They're going to the adrenaline's pumping, and they're going to fight and argue and lash out, all those things. Freeze is another one I think we don't recognize as much, but they're the ones that will withdraw into themselves. And we had one child when we got her, she was 5. She would, like, if she was overwhelmed, she would just, it's almost like she's in a coma, like she's not really there. And it's not a healthy, we think like this looks healthier, but it's actually the worst because everything is pulling into themselves. Internalized. And a lot of teenagers in depression, the ones that aren't outward fighting, we say, what, it didn't seem like anything was wrong. Like they seem like they were fine, but they're pulling everything in, and it's that right. Freezing. And so that is a harder issue. So really it is with your kids. You need to say like, okay, this is a flight, but like with one of our teenagers, we're like, okay, if you feel like you need to just go, you can walk around the block, and we'll kind of like follow you around. Just know, like, it was her way to kind of work it out, and that's okay. Like, we had to learn with that child. It just helped her to like go and get that adrenaline out and walk around the block. And we kind of like keep an eye on her to make sure like nothing's going to happen. But she needed that. The fight, we just have to teach good responses about, okay, you are really angry, and I know that you feel like screaming in my face, but time out, maybe go to your room. And so her therapist taught her like just go and maybe punch her pillow or something that would get it in a more healthy way. So you could help them, even though they're having these responses, you could help them do it in a healthy way. And then if we see the ones that are kind of the freeze, that are pulling into themselves, you need to figure out, like, pull them out. Like one of my daughters, she'll want to like shut down. I'm like, okay, you can for like 10 minutes, but then I'm going to come and sit by you and I'm going to see how you're doing. And it's just really like kind of going in and rubbing her back and letting her know. And at first she's like, don't touch me type of thing, but letting her know, like, I'm not going to let you pull into yourself. But I think we do need to be aware of all the different responses that kids have.
Well, yeah. And then knowing how long do you really wait before you do address that? And I know there's no perfect answer, but coming back around with your children and touching base after they've calmed themselves is so important.
Mm-hmm, it is. And you really have to kind of, again, going back to empathy, like I get angry too. And sometimes you even say like, that would have made me angry. Like if a neighbor kid down the street said that to me, that would make me angry. That probably wasn't the best response. And like one of our kids, when she would explode, she would calm down better if I just sat in the room. So I'm actually sitting there praying, but I'm not lecturing her. She's just ranting and raving. And I'm like sitting there. Sometimes I'll pick up a book and flip through a book, but just me being in the room, it would be like 15 minutes. And she was able to me sitting there, my presence was able to calm her down. And then probably in another 15, 20 minutes, we were able to talk about it. Now, some kids, they need a while, they need to process it more. So later that night, I'm like, oh, let's go talk about that. Let's figure out. But it does help to bring it around, and always with empathy. Like I get angry too sometimes. I get angry.
Yes.
And really talking about what helps us. And sometimes what really helps me. Sometimes it just helps me to go sit in my room, shut the door, and pray, or just give them tools that they can use. But come back around and say, this is all something that we all have to deal with. And I've talked about, I got in a fist fight once in high school, and they love hearing that story.
My kids love to hear. Same.
I know.
Same. Even my friends now sometimes will be like, you got in a fist fight? I'm like, I can't believe y'all can't see it in me that could actually happen.
I know. So I'll be like, remember, I used to be like, I'd be like, because now every time I see them kind of working up, and sometimes you could even use humor.
Yeah.
So I'll see something going on. I'm like, hold my hoops. Because that's a thing
that's right.
Let me hold my hoops because I'm going to go in and fight. And so sometimes I'll see them kind of getting worked up. I'm like, okay, is this a hold my hoops moment? And it kind of just breaks the ice.
Yeah.
Where they're like, okay, I'm not going to go there. So I think sometimes, and it really is just sometimes you're like, okay, this is not a joking moment. But sometimes if you could see maybe there's an opportunity to kind of joke around and say, I can see you're upset about this, but let's not go there,
Well, and that's some things we're already talking about, some ways to help kids process their anger. Those things like if you're the fight type, maybe going into your room and punching into the pillow or just getting out all the words that you need to get out before you have a normal conversation with whoever you're angry with. The walk. Are there any other things that
Absolutely.
you've had to utilize? Because I know, girl, with 10 kids and then yourself and your husband, I've only got 3, and my toolbox is growing exponentially in my life.
Absolutely. I feel like now I'm like, I don't even know what to do with those first 3 kids. We just kind of coasted along. I don't know. I've just learned so many things. Another thing is water. So I also sometimes if I could see they're really stressed or overwhelmed, why don't you go take a shower, or why don't you go take a bath? it could be the middle of the day in a homeschool day, and they're super upset with the sibling and they're overwhelmed with their math. I'm like, why don't you just go get a bubble bath? And they're like, and it just, the water releases it. Yeah. And blowing bubbles. We actually made calming bags. And I'm trying to think, we probably still have stuff around, but we would literally go to the store and buy bubbles, buy stress balls, buy all these things, fidget spinners, and say, why don't you go blow some bubbles? Because blowing bubbles is you're breathing in, you're breathing out, you're focused on the bubbles. And my 26-year-old, he's 26 now, a couple years ago, we took all the kids to Florida. We found $69 round trip tickets to Florida. My husband was out of town that week for work. I'm like, Nathan, this is the most spontaneous thing I've ever done. I'm like, Nathan, let's take all the kids to Florida and just go see the manatees. And so this is the first time they've flown, 5 of them. First time they've ever flown. And my husband's usually a calming force too. He's not there. So I literally went to the store. I bought bubbles. I bought Play-Doh. I bought gum. Gum's another thing.
Yes.
Just gets it working. We bought all this stuff and we made calming bags. And we're like, okay, we're taking these on the plane. Anytime we go anywhere, when we go to the beach, this is in December, you're going to have your calming bag. And when you feel overwhelmed, this is things you do. We put scripture cards in there. And so letting them know ahead of time, you might be nervous on the plane and it might overwhelm you. You might get angry at a sibling, but you're really just overwhelmed. Letting them know ahead of time. So we are preparing. We're taking your gum, you're taking your calming stress balls, your bubbles, and we're preparing for these things. And so there'd be times I'd be on the Orlando freeway in this rented big, huge white van, and I see one of my teenagers in the back with the stress ball, just because one of her siblings is annoying her. So I think that looking and figuring out those things that will calm them, whether it's bubbles or taking a bath or, going. One of my daughter loves K-pop music, Korean pop music. Why don't you go listen to some K-pop for a while? And she's like, okay. So, just letting them know that you are aware of them and where that they're getting anxious or angry, and then giving them permission to go calm down. Because I know when I'm angry, I just want to like go to my room and read my Bible and pray for 10 minutes, and just letting them know whatever works for them, to give them permission to do that.
Yes.
There'll be times like I have an agenda. We're supposed to be somewhere, but like, you know what? Let's just take 5 minutes before we rush out the door.
That's
We're going to be late,
word
but that's
for me,
okay.
because I'm like the one where I'm not the calming force. And so when we need to be somewhere and everybody's not doing their thing, I'm like just increasing everyone's anxiety. Come on, let's go.
Oh, I've been there.
So those are good, very good tools for me, for sure. All right. So our home environment, it matters when it comes to creating a calm environment. And sometimes we don't even realize some things in our environment that create anxiety or that anxious response in our children. And so what are some common environmental factors that you have seen that can really increase that anxiousness or anger in kids?
Yeah. Well, I think so many times we already mentioned hungry is a thing, environment. Like we need to make sure there's snacks, there's healthy food, but then also sleep is another huge thing that I think we don't think about. I remember one of my very first articles I ever wrote, I was talking to an expert, and she said like teenagers especially get so little sleep. They're basically big toddlers that are having tantrums because they're tired. And I think so many times in our environment with our kids, they're not eating healthy. They're not getting enough sleep. And thankfully, I homeschool now. I mean, I've always homeschooled, but during the homeschool years, like sometimes we'll wake up at 9:30 and it's completely okay. But letting them, and even our older kids, they love staying up. We're like, okay, nope, we're wrapping up. It's 9:30, 10 o'clock. We're going to go. Even if you just lay there and read a book for a while, everyone needs to go to bed because sleep is a thing. And then I think also having just a general schedule, an idea of what is going on during the day. I have some kids that get so anxious, like, what are we doing? What are we going? And we have our, general, like, okay, everyone gets up and they eat breakfast. We all have our chore chart that is on the wall. Everyone knows what their chores are. So it's not me all the time, like, you need to do this, you need to do that. And getting that general schedule. And then if there's something different, tell them that, like, this afternoon, we're going to be going to do this, or letting them know ahead of time. I think so many times we have the schedule in our mind, and all of a sudden we're like, okay, everyone shoes on, and they haven't had time to prepare for what is going on in the day, or what, and I'll even say a couple days ahead of time, like a couple days from now, we're going to be doing this, and it just helps everyone to prepare. And then also just letting the little things go. I was type A personality. Everything had to be clean. Everything had to be organized. I get just so stressed out. I remember walking in, there's 11 pairs of shoes by the front door, and I'm like so upset, and really the laundry, the piles. And I remember just being so upset and overwhelmed like all the time because I'm just so tense because there's another mess. I just cleaned this kitchen. And my husband one day is like, did you really think we could adopt 7 kids and you'd be able to keep the house perfectly clean? And actually, like, until he said that, I'm like, actually, yeah, I totally thought I could. But I have just had to like and there's days literally, because that's really what makes me, I guess, the most tense during the day, when I see a mess, when I just clean something up, or there's stuff on the floor. Too. Why is there paint on this table? Who thought this was a good idea to paint on the table? And really, God kind of had a talk with me. I remember one day just like being so overwhelmed in the lunchroom, and he's like, I love you. Not an audible voice, but like the feeling I got from him. It's like, I love you just as much if you have a pile of laundry as when it's all done. And it was like, okay, I don't know. My mom and my grandma, like, they're always super neat and clean. I'm a firstborn of everybody. It's just like that whole type A personality. There's days I'll just literally say a prayer as I'm walking through the living room, like, it's okay. It's okay. It's okay. Like, and
well,
let it
and
go.
Speaking of like a calm environment, I don't do this well because I'm the same. I get angry and anxious when my environment's out of whack. Mm-hmm. So I've been working more and more instead of just constantly taking it on the kids. And I fail more than I wish I didn't fail as much as I do. But I have tried, and I'm continuing to try to help them understand that part of what fuels my anxiety and my struggle is when you simply just don't put your things away. So let's practice that. Let's keep
Yes.
practicing so we're all helping. Like this is
Absolutely.
a team environment.
Yeah, we're not just going to let it go. And I think there's sometimes like, I know, like I just need to let it go. And there's sometimes like, no,
That's
this
right.
is a teachable moment.
Yeah.
And one thing, my other book is The Grumble Free Year, which came out last November. But one of the things that God really showed me that is because my kids were grumbling all the time because I was grumbling at them all the time. So my daughter, I'd say, she was 12 at the time, go in and clean the kitchen. I don't like cleaning the kitchen. She's grumbling. I'm following her. You need to stop grumbling, whatever.
Yeah.
I
don't
realized
want to clean it either. Oh yeah, that's a familiar one in my
exactly. I realized like as she's cleaning, I'm in there like, okay, you didn't wipe that down, and there's still food on this, and I was like nagging her, and I'm like, who would want to go do a chore when mom is in there the whole time telling you you're not doing a good job?
Oh,
And
girl,
so
you're convicting me.
I'm like, as I'm reading these books about affirming each other and lifting each other up, I'm like, okay, so I made a point that day when she went in there, she's grumbling, totally grumbling like normal. I went in, I'm like walking by, like putting laundry away. I'm like, wow. And she's like kind of wiping the counter. I'm like, that part of the counter really sparkles. And then I go back a little while later and she's wiping more of the counter. Like she's using spray this time. And I'm like, you are doing such a good job wiping that counter. Well, then I go in and she's like really scrubbing off the dishes. And I'm like, I can really tell you're maturing in your chores because you are really doing a good job. I'm telling you, that girl who would grumble and do a half job every single time spent an hour in there cleaning the kitchen. Because every time I would walk by, I would praise her and I would praise her and I would praise her. And pretty soon, like, she spent an hour and I'm in there. I'm like, this is amazing. Then I go call my husband. You need to come and see how she did the kitchen. And that just like boosted her. She's 15 now. She does the kitchen better than anybody. Like, I have to tell her sometimes, you do not have to pre-wash every single dish before you stick in the dishwasher. Because she's like, but I always tell her, like, I'm so glad it's your day to have the kitchen because it always is super clean. And so that went from the child that was probably the worst at doing the chore to now she is the best. And so I really have to remind myself, like, I don't do well if someone's nagging me, but if someone's praising me and telling me I did a good job, like, I'm gonna do it. So that has made a huge difference in just our home environment. When I feel myself wanting to nag, I'll say, like, what can I praise them? How can I praise them for this thing that they're doing?
So then the book, The Grumble Free Year, is it all about that? Like focused on just how to change that grumbling to affirmation?
Yeah, we actually took it on as a challenge as our family because there was so much grumbling. And we went from a ton of anger to not having as much anger, but just the grumbling. Like there's 11 people in our house. Like because grandma's here, my oldest son was still at home, all these kids, everyone was grumbling. And my husband like, we are going to work on this. We're going to give you a challenge for a year. We'll take you on a cruise if everyone works on it. Like we don't even have to be perfect. Like we want everyone to work on it, which we were kind of already planning a cruise with them, but we just made this the motivation.
That's right.
And
kids
and
don't
literally
have to know that part.
They don't have to know that, but we memorized scripture verses. We read about the Israelites. We, practice all these things. And a lot of it, I would say 90% of it came to me like that, like how I'm going to praise them instead of grumbling, like me apologizing. Because I was like, I didn't realize how bad of a grumbler I was until all of a sudden they're like, you're grumbling again, or you're, and so apologizing. So a lot of it, I would say 90% of it came back to how I approach things, how I apologize, how I praise them. It really made a difference. And by the end of the year, it was a night and day difference. Not that we never grumble anymore, but everyone is aware of it more and really works at it a lot better.
We do become what we practice.
It's so true. Yeah.
Tricia, thank you so much for being here today. How can our listeners find you and connect with you?
Well, I would love for them to do that. TriciaGoyer.com is just my website, and Facebook, I'm Tricia Goyer, Instagram, Tricia Goyer, pretty much everywhere. But I would just love if they have even any questions or anything, just feel free to connect with me on any of those places.
Yes, and your website is fantastic because you have the blog and you've got all your links there and all the books there. And so it's a really easy place to go there for all of the things.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
As episode 81 comes to a close, I want to remind you to visit graceenoughpodcast.com and sign up to receive your free download, 10 Scriptures to Pray as a new school year begins during a pandemic. Thank you for listening, and I'll meet you back here next Tuesday with Dr. Sandra Dalton-Smith. We'll be discussing 7 areas of rest and how to begin recovering your energy by identifying your area of deficit.
Thank you for listening to the Grace Enough podcast. Tune in next time.